Hello, good evening. I'm David Corbett and I work here at the Curator and at the Centre for the Arts of the Americas, Curator as well. And this evening I'm really delighted to welcome Matthew Holman to launch his new book, Frank O'Hara MoMA, and there are many, many other copies waiting for us after the events of the evening. So I recommend it to you. Lovely book. Welcome back, actually, I should say, because Matthew has been at the Courtauld before as the postdoctoral fellow at the Centre for the Arts of the Americas during the 2022-23 academic year, when he was an exceptionally active, well-liked and effective postdoc and colleague here. Just before I say something to introduce Matthew, I'll just say very quickly something about the shape of the event tonight. So once I've introduced Matthew, he will talk about the book for a while and introduce it to you and point out some of the major themes. And then there's a conversation with my colleague Lucy Bradnock, followed by the opportunity to respond and to ask Matthew questions and to react to what you've heard in a short Q&A. And after that, everybody is very welcome to join us for some more informal conversation and a drinks reception, which will be held not in this room, but just down the corridor on the right in what is called the Research Forum Seminar Room. And that's where the large piles of these books will be awaiting you. So do not hesitate, please, to join us. So Dr Matthew Holman is lecturer in literature and fine art at the University of Hertfordshire. Apart from his time at the Courtauld, he's been a lecturer at UCL, where he completed his PhD, and has held postdoctoral research fellowships at Yale, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Paul Mellon Center for British Art, and the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies in Berlin. His research has been widely published, including in journals such as Critical Quarterly, the Journal of Modern Literature, and Textual Practice. It's a real pleasure to welcome Matthew and to welcome him back to the Courtauld and to have him talk to us about the book tonight.
Thank you very much, David. Very generous introduction. Thank you. So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see so many of you. So I won't speak for too long, and there'll be some time, obviously, to have a conversation with Lucy. But I'm just going to briefly introduce the book and some of its ideas and themes, I suppose, and look at some of the key exhibitions that O'Hara curated. So I'm going to begin in 1966. So it was a hot night in July. O'Hara gets kind of wheeled down by a Long Island football star on the beach and sadly dies a few days later. So O'Hara, for I'm sure many of us, is known as a poet. He was a poet of the New York School, he was a poet of that generation of 1950s, 1960s. And the New York Times obituary actually doesn't really mention too much about his poetry. It mentions that he was a museum curator for the Museum of Modern Art, also a poet. It's an afterthought. Here we have Alfred Leslie's sort of very sort of derivative mannerist, eccentric kind of picture of O'Hara 10 years later from his death on the beach in Fire Island as a kind of mannerist pastiche. The romantic hero cut down in his prime. So I think for many of us, we know O'Hara as the poet of Midtown Manhattan, wandering around, drinking Strega, writing his poems on his lunch hour from the museum. And my sense is that we know very little, really, or this is my hope, that we know very little until the book about his life as a curator for the Museum of Modern Art. So he began life as an employee of the Museum of Modern Art, selling postcards on the front desk. He really wanted to get admission to the Henri Matisse exhibition that Alfred Barr curated, and he wanted to get free entry, and he wanted to get free entry every day. So he started selling postcards on the front desk. But whilst he was doing that, he soon became a good friend of the abstract expressionist artists at the Cedar Tavern and the club in Greenwich Village and elsewhere, and became close friends with them, became their confidant, and in many ways, in a very sort of dispiriting and disappointing news to any kind of curatorial graduates or aspiring graduates, that was basically the route into him getting this job, not through diligent art historical work. And he gets hired by someone called Porter McRae, who was Nelson Rockefeller's protege. Porter McRae worked a lot with Nelson Rockefeller at the museum, and he was really instrumental in setting up the international program, which I'll talk about more in a moment. John Ashbery, the poet and O'Hara's close friend, said that American painting, and abstract expressionism in particular, absorbed Frank to such a degree, both as a critic for art news and a curator for the Museum of Modern Art, and as a friend to the protagonists, that it could be said to have taken over his life. So O'Hara gets the job through Porter McRae, and he becomes a curator, assistant curator at the Department of Circulating Exhibitions at MoMA. And I just want to say a few words about curation and what it means to be a curator and our expectations of a curator. This maybe is not what we expect from our curators. And when the New York Times obituary ran with its story, it did talk about this painting. It did talk about O'Hara, quote, posed frontally clad and only in shoes and socks for Larry Rivers' O'Hara nude with boots. And the painting, which was actually exhibited at the Jewish Museum in 1965, the New York Times takes issue over whether the unavoidable subject of homosexual desire in the portrait has been resolved. But I think that this portrait, is scandalous for another reason. So the great poet, Eileen Myles, points out that you couldn't have somebody who was working at the museum have a nude portrait of themselves. So, I mean, this idea that, well, what kind of critical objectivity can you hope to have if this is the person who is curating not only the artist that is taking the portrait, but being responsible for, welcome Cedric, good taste, of which Cedric has lots. So the title also is an ironic commentary on the usual anonymity of the nude model, but the boots in the portrait, I think, pay attention to the model as a connoisseur of style and as someone controlling his image rather than being observed by the painter and viewer of the painting. And O'Hara emerged at a time before widespread professionalization of the curatorial profession, when the figure of the curator was nevertheless a sense that the role required critical distance, and that taking one's clothes off in front of artists foreclosed that. And it's also worth bearing in mind that Walter Rasmussen, who was sort of O'Hara's superior in this period, described him actually as he was under suspicion for a long time as a gifted amateur. That he did have a degree from Harvard, and he was very talented in many respects, but was fundamentally seen as too intimate to the artist, and his life was too open to the artist that he was curating. I'm just going to say briefly a few words about some of the exhibitions that he curated. I'm going to just skip over that briefly and return back to Jackson Pollock in a moment. As we will see, and I'll look at some poems, but we'll see how O'Hara conceives perhaps of his exhibitions a little like his poems, and his poems a little bit like his exhibitions. And in the mid-1950s, MoMA had a very ambitious program of trying to situate the abstract expressionist artists at mid-career. So this was 1955. As we will see, Jackson Pollock dies in a car crash in 1956. David Smith dies also in a car crash in 1965. I'll talk about those exhibitions in a moment. And O'Hara's great friend, Franz Klein, dies. And so he was a great elegiac poet. He wrote a lot of poetry about the death of friends, the death of Billie Holiday, and he does a lot of memorial exhibitions which kind of take on a similar kind of tone, as we'll explore in a moment. Thankfully, someone who didn't die is Helen Frankenthaler, and here is O'Hara at her first retrospective, which he curates not at MoMA but at the Jewish Museum in 1960. And I just want to read briefly from a piece of writing that O'Hara makes about her, because I think that the period that we're, and this is something that perhaps Lucy and I will unpack, but the period that we're looking at, abstract expressionism, was weighed down by a critical framework, predominantly by people like Clement Greenberg and Howard Rosenberg. And within that critical framework, there was a lot of effort and a lot of unity which was sought in order to make a strong claim for American arts, the American avant-garde kind of coherence in the modernist teleology. And O'Hara sort of disrupts that by writing criticism like a poet, and invited the ire, I think, of people like Greenberg. But I'll just give you a bit of a sense of how he wrote about Frankenthaler on the occasion of the Jewish Museum show. She refuses to abandon her sensitivity to nature or any other force external to the act of painting. Although there is a vague feeling of landscape about many of her new pictures, she goes no further towards representation than her experience leads her. On the other hand, she will not make a picture in the technical sense. She is the medium of her material. Welcome. Never polishing her insights into a rhetorical statement, but rather letting the truth stand forth plainly and for itself. O'Hara was also the first, we reread the first monograph on Jackson Pollock in 1959, and in 1958, he curated the travelling exhibition with the international programme of Jackson Pollock's memorial retrospective. Here it is at the Whitechapel Gallery, sort of co-curated or involved with the great Brian Robertson, who was the director at the time. And so in 1957, there's the exhibition at MoMA, and then it travels to Sao Paulo, and then it travels around Europe. And I just wanted to say a little note on Trevor Dannett's design. This was the kind of the architect who collaborated with O'Hara and Robertson on this. So there's a background for some paintings. There's the closely woven white muslin, finally pleated into a texture which Brian Robertson described as the underbelly of a mushroom. There's very few neutral walls or unobtrusive white walls to situate the viewer in the sort of the conventions of the gallery space. And these very, very powerful blocks kind of recalled the, I don't know, building site perhaps, but they're very hard, they're very firm. And Dannett described the exhibition as a Mondrian in 3 dimensions. It received a very mixed press reception, to say the least. A great Marxist critic, John Berger, described Pollock's work as having the ability to speak, he acted dumb. Here, a little like James Dean. So a lot of the press reception of the 1958 Whitechapel show focused on imagining Pollock as a kind of James Dean figure. Many of the newspapers as well noted the presence of John Hay Whitney at the opening. So he was there. Who is John Hay Whitney? So at the time, he was the US ambassador to London, and he was photographed alongside other kind of cultural diplomats. And like Nelson Rockefeller, who established the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and then the international program in 1952 with a grant to support overseas exhibitions and to support the circulation of American art overseas. And I'll say a little bit more on that in a moment. But at the time, he was the US ambassador to Great Britain. He had been president of MoMA following Nelson Rockefeller's resignation in January 1951, and then he became chairman of the board, a position that he held until becoming ambassador in 1957. What I want to just briefly gesture to here, and there's not an awful lot of time to discuss this in detail, but is the revolving doors between the American diplomatic establishment and the Museum of Modern Art in the circulation of exhibitions, of which O'Hara, I think, was a slightly unwitting figure that played a very, very important role. Whitney and Rockefeller obviously had tremendous dynastic wealth, and that they recognized that the Cold War could not be won with the sheer force of the military-industrial complex alone. They needed to win hearts and minds, and they also needed to win over the conservative critics in Congress who believed that the vast majority of modern art was aligned to communism. So Whitney and Rockefeller saw avant-garde painting as central to this purpose in the consolidation of, quote, democratic ideals overseas, and they saw Porter McRae and, to some extent, Frank O'Hara as important to that mission. So, as I say, here steps O'Hara into a world that is very different to getting drunk at the Five Spot, and a world which is very different to talking about art and ideas with your artist friends in a bar in Greenwich Village, but it actually brings him into, unwittingly or not, into the world of Cold War intrigue and cultural diplomacy. So in 1959, O'Hara curates the American representation, or the American, sort of, in effect, the American representation of the Documenta 2 in Kassel in West Germany. And I'm just going to read a brief, some words from Werner Haffmann, who was the curator of the entire Documenta 2. This was a time in which, I suppose, abstract art, gestural abstract art, abstract expressionism became seen as a lingua franca. It became seen as against or in tension with the rigid social realism of communist countries at the time, or socialist countries at the time, and particularly in the case of Germany, the sort of the long shadow of didactic realism under the Nazis. So there was this effort to align abstract art, gestural abstract art, and abstract expressionism in particular, to ideas of liberty and freedom and gesture. Werner Haffmann. But one can also not overlook the fact that modern art has already become a powerful worldwide means of drawing people together. In the last decade, it has actually done so, and it has been able to overcome all the hindering differences of speech, location, history, racial feeling, and folklore. Its forms of expression and its depiction of experiences have, for the first time since its inception, given a positive reality to the romantic idea of a world culture. From Europe, over both the Americas, over Africa and Asia, as far as the Far East, it has awakened an inner accord and has invested this accord with a free speech form that makes possible direct communication. That all sounds very good. We'll see if that works. Pollock, in this view, was front and center. Pollock was the sort of the archetypal gestural painter. And for Haffmann, Pollock was, in his words, a dancing dervish with a dripping paint can performing the desperate choreography of his life, whose intensity of nature cost him his life. So at the Documenta 2 exhibition, perennial exhibition, we might see it as alongside perhaps the Venice Biennale in 1958. But unlike the Venice Biennale, it was not organised around national pavilions. It was organised around a denationalised display in which all of these gesture paintings and abstract paintings were going to be shown alongside one another in a way that demonstrates that if you are free, you are making abstract paintings. And of the 700 paintings included, 685 were non-figurative, which gives you a sense of how dominant it was. Haffmann continues, he says, since it is the wish and desire of the committee of Documenta not to accentuate the various countries in their characteristics, but to call special attention to the multiplicity of international directions in art since World War II, the paintings and sculptures will not be arranged according to nationalities. The problem, really, was that Werner Haffmann and Arnold Bode, his friend who was co-curating, they were a bit short on cash. So they turned to the deep pockets of the Museum of Modern Art, to Porter McRae, and ultimately to Frank O'Hara in order to fund the exhibition, or fund a significant part of it. McRae was pretty happy about this turn of events. He says, while various organisations in the European countries represented are also cooperating, the international program is the only organization that has been accorded the honor of being invited to choose the artists as well as the work including in its national selection. And as you can see from this particular, these three archival photographs, but they're all from the same vantage point, but from slightly different perspectives, we can see how over-determined the curation is. You even have paintings, I think, by Gottlieb, which is right above. There, it's incredibly hectic, it's incredibly narrow. Imagine trying to traverse this central walkway, the central corridor. And the reason for this is that the Americans were given the only ticket to curate a national exhibition. So they wanted to make it as busy and as full of the American art that they wanted to promote as possible. And again, this sort of demonstrates, I think, how O'Hara's perhaps enthusiasm for the artist that he's curating leads over into some kind of political questions and problems. In the November 1959 issue of Arts magazine, the consternation and castle spilled over into being pretty pissed off. Documenta, this is a German art critic, Documenta, an American assault on Europe. They dictated their own contribution, chose it, sent it, paid for it, the pictures as big as possible, and look how weakly the Europeans are picked. Don't you see an intention in that? So O'Hara, as generous enthusiast for the artists by his friends and those that he wanted to champion, in this particular moment was seen to be over-determining his curatorial hand, I suppose. But I just want to briefly talk about one of the works which was in this display, which returns me back to the central, or the earlier question around intimacy, and the earlier question around what does it mean to be a curator, and what does it mean to curate exhibitions of art and artists with whom you really care about and who you're very passionate about. So this particular painting, Willem de Kooning's Summer Couch from 1943, was owned by O'Hara. It was also one of several paintings in the Documenta 2 exhibition, which featured paintings by artists who were directly inspired by him, including Joan Mitchell's To the Harbour Master, based on one of his poems. And I'll read out a poem now called Radio, which is about O'Hara's love of this painting, and it was a gift from another painter called Fairfield Porter, who ultimately he wanted the painting back. But this is Radio. Why do you play such dreary music on Saturday afternoon? Tired, mortally tired, I long for a little reminder of immortal energy. All week long I trudge fatiguingly from desk to desk in the museum. You spill your miracles of Grieg and Honegger on shut-ins. Am I not shut in too? And after a week of work, don't I deserve Prokofiev? Well, I have my beautiful de Kooning to aspire to. I think it has an orange bed in it, more than the ear can hold. So this 13-line poem, which O'Hara wrote as he was sort of thinking about this exhibition and curating it, it's unusual. There aren't that many 13-line poems. It's an understated form. It's consciously one line short of a sonnet. And in this poem, we find our poet distracted and tired and a little bit bored. So the museum, as he describes it, MoMA, is described in terms of being kind of pretty boring workplace. He trudges from desk to desk, not the vibrant place of wonders that appears in many of his other poems. And the final tercet is striking. We have de Kooning here, the abstract expressionist painter, someone who he loved, someone who was on his deathbed. And he claims that the orange in it is more than the ear can hold. And there's a confusion, of course, of the senses. The music on the radio has accompanied his work in paintings, and it's caused this kind of strange blurring effect. And he described de Kooning as being too much for his ears instead of his eyes. And the reason why I talk about it in relation to Documenta, which is here it is on the wall, is that in a way, as Summer Couch was transported from O'Hara's office to the walls of Documenta, its interpretation as a canvas that privileged abundance and joy over restraint has then been shut in by the architectures and the very claustrophobic architectures of display at Documenta. So at Documenta, O'Hara was also, I suppose, trying to push beyond the category of abstract expressionism as well. He showed he didn't show, he sent, but it wasn't ultimately shown, Robert Rauschenberg's bed and two other combines which were ultimately not displayed. And also, as I say, shipped but didn't display Joan Mitchell's to the harbour master. So in particular, in the case of Bed, he's moving towards a kind of art beyond abstract expressionism, so beyond the work of his friends. And briefly, I'm just going to conclude on the work of David Smith. So, as I say, very optimistically, MoMA wanted to do several exhibitions of work by artists who were at mid-career. So that may have seemed hopeful in 1955, but there was a succession of deaths, including, of course, sadly, David Smith in 1965. And importantly for O'Hara's biography, this is an important show. So O'Hara dies as this exhibition is still on display. He dies, as I said at the beginning, he dies on the beach in Fire Island, but he's depressed during this period and he's sort of struggling with the managerial responsibilities of the museum. And in a way, the David Smith exhibition is him coming to terms with what kind of curator I think he wanted to be and what kind of curator to the friends that were important to him he wanted to be. So the exhibition was shown at the Kröller-Müller Museum in Otterlo in the Netherlands. And it included 49 sculptures, including works from as early as 1939, although just over half, around 25 works, were produced in the Smith's immensely productive final 5 years of his life. And in particular, there was a strong showing of works from his time in Voltri, Italy, when he worked for a sort of steel manufacturing studio. But as I say, by 1966, the grueling exhibition schedule, his persistent struggles with alcoholism, and a prolonged spell of ill health were taking their toll. And immediately prior to this trip to the Netherlands, O'Hara was bedridden for 2 weeks with a virus infection in his left leg, which was intensely painful, and he actually had to use a cane to the opening. This is O'Hara. The Smiths all arrived in good condition, except for chips on some of the painted zips being one of Smith's great sculptures, which had to be touched up. I'd brought David's own paint. That part was quite melancholy. And in this moment, O'Hara recounts this quite touching image of friendship and loss and recuperation. And the letter demonstrates how intimately O'Hara curated the works themselves and how the proximities afforded by his close friendships with artists like Smith allowed him, for that moment at least, to be there with the works themselves as the artist would. This might be described as a kind of collaboration, perhaps, or a posthumous collaboration of sorts, in which O'Hara's curatorial prerogatives meant that he was able to at once fulfill the creative wishes of an absent friend, while simultaneously contributing to the final finish of the work in an embodied way. During this period, at the opening, as he prepared his speeches, O'Hara remembered a visit to Bolton Landing, where Smith had his studio earlier in 1961, and celebrated his move to polychromatic sculpture in metal, in juxtaposition to Clement Greenberg's scandalous decision to remove the paint from several of Smith's sculptures. They didn't quite fit his story about what modern art should be. And so when he was running the estate after Smith's death, he made his own decisions. Michael Brenson, Smith's biographer, asks, why were the penetrating observations of O'Hara, whose understanding of Smith was as acute in the 1960s as Greenberg's was in the 1940s, not fully acknowledged until half a century later, when Sarah Hamill and David J. Getsky wrote him into the mainstream of the Smith literature? If O'Hara had not died in 1966 at 40, while his Smith show was still on tour, Smith's critical history would surely have been different. So I'm just going to conclude. I think I've spoken nearly for time. Are we good for time? I'm just going to conclude with a statement that O'Hara makes, a curatorial statement that he makes on Smith's sculptures, which I think in many ways embody a lot of what he was trying to do as a curator. It's the nature of sculpture to be there. If you don't like it, you wish it would get out of the way, because it occupies space which your body could occupy. David Smith's sculptures are big or small, figurative or abstract, very complete, very attentive to your presence. They're generous, they have no boring views. Circle them as you may, they are never napping. They present a total attention, and they are telling you that that is the way to be, on guard. In a sense, they are benign because they offer themselves to your pleasure. But beneath that kindness is a warning. Don't be bored, don't be lazy, don't be trivial, and don't be proud. The slightest loss of attention leads to death.
I feel like those final lines are just good life advice in general. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much, Matthew, for that introduction to your book. And I will start just by saying what an absolute pleasure it was to read your book in preparation for this event. I feel like I have a head start on most of the room. And it is a book that is just so pleasurable to read and wears its incredible depth of research so lightly, which is such a joy, and that really kind of fizzes with the detail of discovery. So it's also one of those books that made me feel very envious of you as a researcher, and clearly the time that you have spent with archival materials, pulling at threads in a way that feels sort of absolutely appropriate for a figure like O'Hara, and for the conversation that you were having around intimacy and the kind of everyday space that he has for art and artists. So the first thing I will say is thank you for really such a wonderful book that ranges across art history, but also biography and exhibition history and international geopolitical tensions. But again, that does it so kind of lightly and pulls all of this into the orbit of a book that is really delightful to read, but really kind of unsettles what we think we know about curating, about MoMA, about the Venice Biennale, and about those really canonical moments in the history of American art that we have all been taught as students here and elsewhere, but that take on a very different tenor thanks to your account of O'Hara's activities. And so it was such a joy. And a lot of what I picked up on was what you were speaking about as you unpacked the kind of states of writing about O'Hara, who is also a poet, and who, for Greenberg, writes pseudo-poetry or writes art criticism as pseudo-poetry. So I wonder if we might sort of start thinking about what it is to write about someone who is both poet and curator, and in some senses you kind of set out the stakes of this book as recovering the curatorial career of Frank O'Hara, who is best known as one of the leading voices of the New York poets. And yet it's not an opposition that you're setting up, because you weave his poetry through and his poetic voice through your writing, and you call on that poetic voice often as evidence for a kind of curatorial position. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about both his approach to poetry and curating, but also how you have approached that in your research, thinking about the role of his writing as a poet versus his writing as a curator.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Yes, I mean, the I suppose it's very difficult in many ways to write about abstract art. How do you really get a handle on it? How do you make sense of it? It's not representational. And I think obviously Greenberg had a very important narrative, one which was a very influential narrative, and I think at its heart, really, which I think this is why he was then very influential to people like Michael Fried and lots of art critics who came later, was that if art is going to become very abstract, then we need a critical language with which to understand it, which is objective and is clear about its meanings and very historical in its gesture to those meanings. And O'Hara comes in talking about Jackson Pollock's paintings like a big fat gigolo of a painting in abstract technicolor, and obviously it sort of unsettles that particular sense of the importance of the work. And I think one of the things which I kept coming back to was how we're living, I think, or I would argue, we're living much more in O'Hara's world today in terms of art criticism than Greenberg's, or within that particular model. I think that we do want our art critics to lend a sense of who they are. We do want our art critics to allow some sense of their own critical preferences or their own intimacies with their subject in a way that I think is, or at least art writing expects that and demands that now, even if art criticism maybe is still struggling with that question. So I set out many, many years ago to write a book about O'Hara's poetry outside of New York, and it naturally led to his work for the international program and became much less a project really about his poetry outside of New York, although that does come into it a little bit. And I was interested in taking this artist, or this writer, this critic, this curator, outside of the city with which he's so commonly associated, and to throw him into Madrid and Zagreb and to Venice and to Stockholm and to Otterlo and to all of these different places, and to really work out kind of why he's still worth reading and thinking about, as well as looking at him in relation to people like Greenberg or other critics who had a very different sense of what abstract expressionism means.
It feels like you're sort of setting that Greenbergian style, which is often a kind of very grand narrative teleology, against what is described as O'Hara's brevity, wit, freshness, and the intimacy of the occasional. But it feels like that kind of intimacy of the occasional is about his encounter in that moment with that work, which becomes this incredible kind of personal, intimate thing, not just between him and the artist, and we'll talk about his friendships in a moment, but also a kind of intimate relationship with the work that is not always an attempt to set it as part of a grand narrative of kind of the progression of style. So is that what we might today think of as art writing, rather than the kind of modernist criticism that we perhaps associate with Rosenberg and Greenberg and those others who are always insistently trying to place something in history with a capital H, as opposed to as a kind of personal, occasional encounter?
Definitely, yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, history, with that said, history is very important to the book. Probably the longest chapter is about history, and it's about Spain. And O'Hara gets invited to curate an exhibition he was completely unqualified to curate, which was on post-war avant-garde Spanish painting and sculpture, called New Spanish Painting and Sculpture, which was shown at MoMA in 1960, also under the umbrella of the international program. And what he describes is the intensified historical atmosphere in these works. And this becomes very, I've mentioned a little bit, very, very briefly in the introduction, around the Cold War context. And one of the important Cold War contexts of the book is Spain and Franco's Spain after the Second World War, in which exhibitions like that actually laid a lot of the groundwork for the normalization in many ways of relationship between Franco and Eisenhower and still fascist or sympathetic fascist state on the shores of Europe, because those artists in many ways were being perhaps co-opted by Franco's cultural attaché. So O'Hara in that moment is thinking incredibly historically, but to some extent to a fault, because when he is lending that narrative of that kind of institutional weight and that historical narrative, that these artists are historical rather than of the present, it does do some work in rehabilitating an idea of openness under a fascist state. So he talks a lot about history. He does talk a lot about historical legacies of these works, but he's not trying to do a Greenbergian analysis of history. I think that he thinks that the reason why abstract expressionism is exciting is not because of its historical weight, but because it is there, it's present. And I think he's kind of alive to that sense of why he gets excited about these works, which at the time, we've come a long way from abstract expressionism. I think that's also something which is worth bearing in mind. It doesn't feel very exciting maybe for many of us, and I'm sure that for many of us its earnestness and its heavy breathing is a bit of a put-off, perhaps. But it wasn't the case then, and I'm sure it did feel really exciting in the early 50s to be showing this work and to be showing the work of these artists who you also spent a lot of time in the studios talking about why it was important and talking about existentialism and curatorial and these ideas and debating them. I think that's maybe where he got a sense of history from.
Yeah, and so that that friendship, that set of friendships, the way in which he mobilizes friendships as part of his kind of professional practice, and it seems absolutely crucial for, perhaps for better or worse, right? Because it gives him incredible access to artists who are really kind of on the up. It gives him incredible kind of understanding of their work and a really sort of intimate understanding of their work, as you spoke about with those Smith sculptures. But he also comes under some criticism for operating as a kind of insider, or for what we might describe as sort of nepotism, or certainly kind of favouring particular artists over others. And so there is a kind of sense in which you talk in the kind of opening introduction of the book about intimacy as a form of practice, as a form of interdisciplinary practice, certainly as a form of curatorial practice, that intimacy seems not just a kind of accidental byproduct, but really crucial to how he is manoeuvring particular artists into particular places, also crucial to his international travel and those that he brings in to his orbit, poets like John Ashbery, who kind of helps him out in Paris in a kind of sticky situation when he needs, linguistic assistance or practical assistance. So it's really a kind of practice that is a network of friendships. And what does that do to the role of curator? How does that kind of help us think about the role of individuals, I suppose, when we also have this conception of MoMA as an institution, as a kind of behemoth at that moment, really implicated in Cold War soft power and the kind of practices of international diplomacy. So on the one hand, we have this kind of institution that is really canonical and really powerful in this moment on the world stage. And then we have a kind of individual who is bringing in those kind of personal relationships, friendships, intimacies as a kind of form of professional practice.
Great question. I for the record, I very much see myself and the work of the book is within that line of the Marxist art criticism of the abstract expressionism as a form of soft power. I bought and sold Serge Gilbo's How New York Story, the idea of modern art and all of that. I suppose where the book departs from that a little bit is a sense of the human story. I think if you were to read that book, it's incredibly persuasive, of course, and it is, yeah, it's very, very good scholarship. But I think that I was interested in, well, what does it mean to look at that particular moment in which abstract expressionism and gestural painting more broadly, international gesture painting, gets taken up as a chip within Cold War cultural diplomacy, and what does it mean to kind of look at that story through the eyes not only of the institution but the eyes of an individual curator. And it actually gets a lot messy. It becomes a lot messier than those kind of big, strict, top-down institutional histories present themselves. So I think that I suppose sorry, remind me your question.
I'm not even convinced I framed it as a question, Matthew. I guess just it seems like there's a kind of tension, and a really productive tension, between the sort of familiarity, the friendship, the intimacy, right. And I think to account for that feels like it sort of unsettles that very homogeneous, perhaps monumental understanding that we tend to have of MoMA, but also of that kind of Cold War diplomacy. So I suppose it's kind of to invite you to think about how that intimacy as a form of practice, what that does to the history.
Great, yeah. So I mean, I suppose the word curator comes etymologically from care, to care for something. And O'Hara, as a poet, he cared for so much. He cared in particular for his friends. He cared a lot for the works that he curated. And at the end of the book, I talk about going to see the Alex Katz retrospective at the Guggenheim, in which there's a cutout of O'Hara, and sort of all of that, and Katz sort of saying, that O'Hara, even when he was raging drunk and on his fourth pack of cigarettes, is sort of still fundamentally a defender of you, even if he's shouting at you. And I think that he really did care for these works, and I think to put him in that kind of historical context, I think is what the book tries to do. So it puts O'Hara into these historical moments, whether that's him having to negotiate with those Franco cultural officials they want to get Robert Motherwell's elegy to the Spanish Republic, they want to get the title changed, and that is a big no-no, definitely for Motherwell and for O'Hara as well. So he's there defending his friend, he's there defending an artist's integrity to make an abstract painting about a very, very real historical event, which is the suffering and the loss of the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War, at exactly the moment when there is this kind of diplomatic thawing of diplomatic relations between the USA and Franco Spain. So, for instance, in that moment, he's defending his friend, but he's doing it at kind of quite an incredibly intense historical moment for the cultural Cold War. And I think that there's several examples of that throughout the book, in which that care for the work and care for the political possibilities that the work has invested as abstract paintings by these artists, he does try and defend in the physical space of the exhibition.
And it feels like the 29th Venice Biennale.
Yeah.
29th, yeah.
You have to think about the Roman.
That feels like another moment where you have this sort of conversation about internationalism versus provincialism, and the sort of fraught negotiation of America's position on the world stage, and these huge claims that are being made for abstract expressionism, for abstraction in general as having a kind of universalizing potential. And it feels like in those moments that are playing out in the space of national pavilions and the kind of international art press, O'Hara often feels like he's sort of arguing or curating for a more nuanced position, or almost what we might now kind of think about almost pushing back against that binary, right? That something is either kind of international and universal, or it's this provincializing thing. But actually in his hands, those exhibitions and those works feel like they can be both somehow, and it feels almost like his intimacy is about nuance, which sometimes works and sometimes gets a little bit lost in the mix, perhaps.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we sort of imagine, I think, that period, so from the early 50s until maybe Robert Rauschenberg wins the grand prize in 1964 at the Venice Biennale, with the American army moving his works around and onto little boats in Venice. I suppose we think about that period as entirely monopolized in a very one-directional way, in a very forceful and powerful way that America and American institutions, the USIA, the international program, sometimes funded by CIA money, whatever, we see it as a very one-directional thing, one-directional process. And that story really is very much incomplete for two reasons. One of which is the Europeans at that moment had their own agenda. So in 1958, at the Venice Biennale that you mentioned, Lucy, the Europeans at this particular juncture are trying to build a European superstate. It's the beginnings of the European Union, and they want to have models of internationalist, very pro-Atlantic art forms, which get taken up. So at that moment, the curators of Venice actually really want and need, in their own mind, these works to present a particular narrative for European integration. And the other, I suppose, disruption to that story is the place of realism. And we also imagine that during this period, MoMA's international program, other institutions adopt wholesale abstract expressionism. That's the only art form. When actually, it's a much slower, more complicated, less easy trajectory, really, in terms of why those institutions adopt abstraction. And part of the reason for that, and Alfred Barr makes it very explicit, part of the reason for that is that if you demonstrate artistic plurality, you are demonstrating freedom under a capitalist system. And the Soviets obviously don't allow that because they don't really allow abstraction anymore. So there's those kinds of small curatorial gestures. And O'Hara's kind of in this space, and he's like, well, actually, I'd really like Grace Hartigan to be in the show, or I'd like this artist to be in the show. And he's kind of slightly, a little bit kind of hair between the headlights, but he's trying to kind of make sense of these bigger, grander historical conditions in which art, I mean, you're almost nostalgic today as you're reading this, you're almost nostalgic that states believe in art. You're almost nostalgic that these states believe that there is a kind of cultural diplomatic mission for painting. Imagine that today. I mean, it's really, we're very far from this. So I think that it was a time when, particularly at Venice, particularly at Documenta, particularly at Sao Paulo, art meant something, and it had political value, that there was a sense that it could shape hearts and minds, and it can help make people feel like they're European, or it could make them feel like actually America isn't just washing machines and Cadillacs and debt. It is also ideas, and it is also painting, and it is also these things that we should care about. And I think that on that, O'Hara enters into this space somewhat naively, but he plays an important role.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to kind of think of that moment where the debate about abstraction and figuration has real geopolitical heft does make one feel a little bit nostalgic. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a sense in which it's the narrative of his career is almost kind of stumbling accidentally into this incredibly important role as an international curator, with geopolitical consequences, but also with cultural and institutional ones. And there are these moments that he feels kind of somewhat, or the work that he's showing, or the work that he brings together is slightly out of step with that tendency to need to take sides, that you are, either on the kind of side of international abstraction and the kind of rise of gestural abstraction, or you are kind of harking back to something more provincial. But he seems to kind of almost refuse the terms of that debate sometimes, and yet, accidental though his career seems to be, or he's, you know, he does kind of stumble into it slightly naively, he is also a really shrewd international operator. And this account of him outside of New York as he is kind of moving across Europe in these really kind of important, politically important, culturally important moments, spaces, institutions, what he can persuade people to do, but also the kind of canniness that he shows in understanding what is required of that particular moment seems really remarkable for someone who is, I mean, sort of an amateur, maybe a bit of an amateur. And you mentioned, as you kind of set up that narrative of his biography, a few other names in that moment of the 1950s, Walter Hopps, for example, Henry Geltzaler. I would add Lawrence Alloway into that mix also, actually.
He's welcome.
Thank you. So there is this kind of moment where we see almost, I don't want to say a new breed of curator, but certainly figures who seem to operate in this manner that isn't coming out of a kind of academic training necessarily, or even an art historical training, but kind of moving much more as in social circles, or as kind of impresarios, or in that space of intimacy, perhaps. So is that the kind of beginning of a shift in what it is to be a professional curator, or perhaps a kind of conception of the idea of curator as something else? Or do you feel like O'Hara and those others are more anomalous than that?
It's a great question. I mean, I think in those, certainly as you've just described, in those kinds of characteristics, O'Hara is a bit of a prototype for a very modern curator, a very contemporary curator, because I'm sure many curators today will tell you that is much of the job. That much of the job is being charming enough to get funding, understanding how to manipulate particular organs within the institution in order to get what it is that you want. And he was, just for the record, he was widely loved, but his institution, the international program, was entirely hated by MoMA because they were very glamorous. They would travel, they got all of the money from Rockefeller, and they didn't have to fight over little bits and pieces. So, and actually there was a coup which took out Porter McRae in the early 60s, and then O'Hara was sort of his own position was quite destabilized by that. But I think that there is a sense today, possibly, there might be some purists in the room, but I'm sure many of us today will go and see an exhibition because we know the curator, or we go and see an exhibition because we have heard about a particular relationship between the person who's organized it and the work which is on display. I know that the vast majority of the debates, for instance, about Venice or any of these big perennial exhibitions are almost always around the curator and almost always around their vision and their sense of what's important. Often that speaks also to criticism, and much of the criticism of the last Venice Biennale was around the curation of the show rather than necessarily the work itself. So I think that the role of the curator, maybe it's outsized today, but is very central regardless in discourse around contemporary art. And I think O'Hara's personality-driven, intimacy-driven, kind of populist-driven in a way, like he doesn't make it incredibly strenuous and difficult for his audiences to understand what the work is about and why should we be really excited about it. Those are all qualities that I feel are the qualities of a very modern curator, and not one which is necessarily the qualities of an Alfred Barr. Possibly.
He does seem very, I think Barr is an interesting example, isn't he? And you talk in the book about Barr's really famous diagram, the kind of development of modern art, that I think is sort of part and parcel of any art history syllabus. And and the way in which, in some senses, there is a kind of purism going on there that we don't see in O'Hara, where there is this kind of cross-fertilization between curating and writing poetry, between curating and hanging out at a bar, or, you know, friendships and professional relationships, and that kind of very, that sense of kind of intimacy and cross-fertilization feels really crucial to his practice. Just before we do open up for questions from the room, and as we think about intimacy and the role of the curator, we sort of started out with that almost accusation from Clement Greenberg, and maybe we can end with another kind of accusation that was levelled at him, and that question about whether a curator can be a nude model, which put me in mind of Carol H. Schneeman's question, can an art historian be a naked woman? But it is this kind of perennial tension or accusation that one can't have a kind of an intimate or even an erotic or a homoerotic self or relationship, and also have objectivity, authority, the kind of propriety maybe that comes with the role of being a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, being a curator in New York, being a curator on the international stage. And so I wanted just to kind of think a little bit about what the politics of that question might be, and where a kind of queer politics features in some of what we've been describing, the kind of refusal to adhere to a kind of Greenbergian teleology, or the insistence on that kind of personal encounter with the work of art, which is all kind of bound up in that question, accusation, isn't it, of, you know, how can you have objectivity if you are posing nude for Larry Rivers?
Well, as far as I know, I mean, I don't think Greenberg posed nude for the artist that he championed. Thank God, maybe, but I think that he certainly wasn't objective as well. I mean, that's also it. I mean, this sort of idea that, like, that within O'Hara's particular style, there is this sense of it being very porous between poetry, pseudo-poetry in Greenberg's view, or it's art criticism, not quite, or is it curatorial text, not quite, is it this, is it this, is it this? Whereas Greenberg sort of is very clear about the role and sort of the definition and the delimitation of what criticism should be and what it needs to be at this moment. But Greenberg, of course, was not. He cared, you know, he cared a lot about this work. He cared about his horse in the race compared to other people's horse in the race, and that's why he, I think, in many ways, was encouraged to provide those very firm historical, teleological ways of understanding these work in relation to those artists that he was personally closest to as well. I mean, I think it's an important question around sort of embodiment in many ways, or representation around. I mean, the reason why Miles is particularly drawn to that nude portrait rather than, for instance, you know, this one which is on the front cover of the book, which is also by Larry Rivers, you know, is this sense of who is on the inside and who is on the outside, who is intimate with the artist and who needs to keep their distance in order to provide a full and objective account of the qualities of not as them as an individual, not as them as a lover, but as them as, or their work specifically in relation to into their significance. So I think that I like thinking about that new portrait because it still feels quite provocative. You know, he's wearing the boots, but the boots are on the breeze block. But I think that in many ways, to show that in an institution that is also showing other work by artists. I mean, for instance, there's a great poem by O'Hara on seeing Larry Rivers' Washington crossing the Delaware, and he shows Larry Rivers' painting, George Washington crossing the Delaware, which is a kind of postmodern revision of the kind of the great heroic romantic vision of George Washington. Apparently even Joseph McCarthy quite liked Larry Rivers' version. But they're all ways in which he's disrupting the sense of him as someone who can ever possibly be qualified to look calmly and objectively on this work. And I think that is, whether we think about that from a queer perspective, you know, the sense of saying that this is going to be an intimacy that I place on this work, it obviously is quite threatening in many ways to lots of the gatekeepers around those artists at that particular time. And definitely also, you know, when Greenberg's talking about O'Hara as a pseudo this, pseudo this, pseudo this, I don't think you need to read too much between the lines to be thinking that that is an attack on his kind of queerness and on his sense of openness and intimacy. For instance, on Larry Rivers, with whom he had, you know, a brief relationship. So there's all of that in play in those accusations, and I think there's worse things to be accused of than being someone who celebrates intimacy.
Perhaps that's a nice sentiment on which to open up questions and thoughts from the audience. We do have a roving mic, so Romy will head up and down the stairs as required.
Do you mind passing that down?
Thank you for the talk. Not to hammer too much on the Greenberg question, but I definitely agree with you that we're living more in O'Hara's world of art criticism now. And, you know, I think that Greenberg would say not just that it's important to chart and identify movements as they affect one another teleologically, but that by charting and identifying those movements, the critic participates in them and contributes something through the active discourse. And I think that in the time that we've lost negative competitive critics, we've also kind of lost the teleology of those movements themselves.
Yeah.
And it's hard now to identify one movement from another. There are very few dominant trends, and at the same time, there are very few negative competitive critics.
I think that's a great point, and I think O'Hara is to blame, not to blame, but I think that O'Hara, it felt quite antagonistic and maybe exciting and maybe even a little bit radical in the 1950s to be a critic who is also an unapologetic celebrant of the work that he puts forward. I think that, yeah, to a fault, that's definitely the world that we're living in now. There aren't enough, in my view, I agree completely that there isn't, particularly in art writing, there isn't that kind of critical debate. There isn't a Greenberg who is necessarily saying, I'm going to put my finger on exactly what's happening now and give it a name and provide a historical reason for its emergence. I think that we have lost a lot of that, and I think that probably critics are too cozy, or art writers are often too cozy with the people that they write about. I don't know, but I think that's a good point. There is something which has been lost in the critical discourse, possibly through O'Hara's sense of intimacy with the people that he doesn't really write bad reviews, right? I mean, you know, this is it, and I think that we do need critics who are willing to write bad reviews, who are willing to not only challenge their friends like Alex Katz in the pub, but also to be, you know, pushing them in different critical ways. So I think that's a good point, that we have lost also what Greenberg, you know, should be rightly remembered for in many ways, is identifying something happening. And I think that, you know, he was in that way. He was still a Mark, even after everything. He was still kind of a Marxist partisan review critic at heart, who wanted to understand that relationship between the artist and society in a meaningful, materialist, and historical way, of which, yeah, O'Hara, to his correct criticism, didn't. Great question.
That's okay.
That's really a question. It's more like something to say, but it's also because now we're not living in a monoculture so much. So it's really hard to look like we are more in a polyculture. So it's very hard now to pinpoint what's happening, how is it happening, who is making this happen. Like there are so many. It's not that trends don't last. It's just that there are so many at the same time. And I think caging what's happening in art into one thing and letting someone like Greenberg be able to say like, okay, this is what happening and I would like to talk about it. It's really hard. Like, it's so it's not being pleasant with everyone and not being critic, but what are we being critic of, and what is the marker to criticize what's happening? It's
and of course the platform for, I mean, Greenberg writing in The Nation, writing in Partisan Review. I mean, those journals monopolized discourse, sort of kind of highbrow critical discourse on the arts in New York at that time. Now it's very, as you say, it's much more dispersed. It's, for better or worse, much more democratized. And lots more places in which we can read and take advice or information or criticism from our critics.
Now it's Substack, it's really hard. Like I read
Exactly, yeah. The proliferation of all of that media. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if that's the cause to be
like how
celebrating or to be cursing.
Who would be taking that position of being able to say, I can tell what's happening now? It's difficult.
Yeah, it is. I think that we would probably not trust someone who would be telling us that that was what they were doing.
Like you said.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Conversation. I have like one question, but maybe in like two parts, like more of a practical part of the question, which is basically about. Also, forgive me if maybe my question arises that maybe I missed something, but about Frank O'Hara's like poetry and his art writing, like from Lucy's first question. I was wondering, basically, practically, when you were writing the book, like how, if you had any specific approach towards looking at one and then the other form of writing, and if maybe like the attention that you paid, or maybe if you saw them as like all emerging from like a similar, like a singular like consciousness, but then it articulated in different ways, and like the affordances of each form potentially, if you saw that.
Yeah.
But then like that also translates to me in a broader question, not just about the practicalities of when you wrote this book, but also if you have any thoughts about, I don't know, we talked a lot about Frank O'Hara being like this kind of figure that has led to our time, and we've kind of lived this Frank O'Hara time. But then I also see this specific angle like of the poetry and the art, visual arts connection as like very much a part of the moment with the Harlem Renaissance and in America, and I mean, it's only really more recently that they've become so separate. So it's actually maybe he's one of the last figures of that kind of mixing, potentially. And yeah, so I don't know if you see that also, that kind of that as like an interesting thing, that, or if there's a loss or some interdisciplinary series there.
Thanks so much. Both great questions. So I think the first one. Yeah, it is. I mean, to be honest, I really enjoyed that aspect actually, by looking at a particular figure who basically does some version, however limited maybe, but like however exuberantly articulated, he includes a version of art criticism in his poetry. So most of O'Hara's best loved poems are poems either about painters or about paintings. He included, particularly, for instance, in the Jackson Pollock 1959 monograph for George Brasilia, he included a poem which is about walking through MoMA and looking at Metzinger and looking at something else, and then arriving ultimately at the end at Pollock. So he's doing both, and I think that was actually a joy, to be honest. I think that it was really, and also the other important element which I drew a lot on in the book is his letters. So unfortunately, they're still not published. I think there's some of the great unpublished letters of any poet in the 20th century. They should be published, and they are also fantastic documents in which he's celebrating friendship, in which he's celebrating life, and he's celebrating his kind of enthusiasms for traveling and looking at art. So looking at those three different forms, I had to be quite distinct when it came to, for instance, an exhibition text, which would be then included within a book, which would then be sold at a particular exhibition, which would then contribute to the reception of that exhibition. that's quite a clear kind of route through in terms of where that work is going to be read and understood. But as a whole, I wanted to collapse some of those distinctions between, okay, O'Hara is now writing a poem, and now he's writing an exhibition text, now he's writing a letter, because looking at the life of him as a figure, that those weren't distinctions that he himself made, and therefore the work itself didn't lend themselves. And I think you're right that maybe, we talked a little bit about nostalgia earlier, but maybe we are a little bit nostalgic for a world in which, when O'Hara died, Philip Guston said he was our Apollinaire. So even at that moment, Philip Guston is nostalgic for Cubism. And so there is this sense that every great artistic movement needs its poets in order to maybe understand it. I mean, it's not a great book in my opinion, but David Lehman's book, The Last Avant-Garde, speaks to that conundrum really of, can we still have avant-gardes? Is that still a possible phenomenon, particularly in the light of some of the early discussions we were having about criticism and art making? So yeah, I think that it would be good if we could, but I don't know if we're certain historical conditions, the way that we consume art, the way that we communicate, foreclose some of that sense of what really needs to be a closed world of an avant-garde until it ultimately gets co-opted by capital.
It feels like, I'm going to jump in, it feels like one of the real strengths of your approach, though, is that you refused to privilege and prioritise one of those writing forms over the other. It feels like you are taking all of those on absolutely equal terms as giving us something that allows us to understand both O'Hara and also the work that he's writing about. And I think that's, that is a real kind of skill to have that, to not kind of say, well, this is art criticism and this is not, that actually one of those forms is kind of subordinate to the other, but to keep those in play as he seems to have done.
Hi, that's a good time to start my question. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that talk. It was fab. I'm really interested in the relationship between Larry Rivers and Frank. Like, Frank moved to New York in 1951, and for like 4 years they have this like very strange sort of like friendship. It's kind of very erotic. They're sort of sitting together. Frank's kind of in love with him, and at the same time they're like working together constantly. Frank's coming around, like Larry's painting him. He's reading poems. I'm interested in maybe how much you feel like Frank's like later curatorial career, after it kind of all wraps up romantically with Larry, like how much Frank's artistic taste might have been shaped by Larry, or how much like Larry's artistic taste might have been sort of like shaped by Frank, and maybe which came first. Like, it's also interesting because like Larry hated Jackson Pollock, I think, famously.
Yeah, he had.
And then also, I guess, like Larry moves away from kind of abstraction towards like more representative stuff. So yeah, sort of want to, like, how much of Larry can we see in Frank's curatorial life, which I guess is much later?
I think that's a fantastic question. I mean, that's also really important, and there is elements of it in the book, which is, to be honest, the group that O'Hara was closest to personally was not even the abstract expressionists. It was this, I mean, there's a kind of like, I won't get into it now, there's a whole side, very contested debate within New York school studies, which is against the idea of talking about generations. Because we have an idea of heroic, macho, de Kooning, Pollock, Klein, Smith, many of the artists, unfortunately, that talks about tonight. As the first generation, they start things, and then there's a slightly queered or generation in which kind of women and queer artists are kind of included. So I think there's a problem really in using the word generation. But if we look at it in a relatively sort of strict social world question, O'Hara was closest to Larry Rivers and closest to Jane Frylicker and Nell Blaine and Fairfield Porter, and they were figurative artists predominantly. And then I think that I think it's a great question really in terms of how he influenced. I mean, from a curatorial perspective, O'Hara kind of moves from doing these sort of group shows and doing exhibitions like recent American watercolors, for instance, which is looking at the way in which, bizarrely, the avant-garde started to use watercolors again and why, in which he does feature lots of that sort of second generation group. And then in the 1960s, at least from a curatorial perspective, he does these big monographic shows, often memorial exhibitions. So I suppose looking at the period in which you define as when they sort of fall out, but it's also a bit of a time when he sort of falls out with Grace Hartigan as well. And so you could definitely map that the sociality of that decade and think, okay, well now it's this which is this trigger, which means that he's now doing these slightly more conventional or monographic exhibitions. But I don't know if that quite holds water within like actually how things are going on. Are you interested in Larry Rivers first or O'Hara first?
I think O'Hara first. I'm sort of like writing a play about them actually, but yeah.
You're writing a play about O'Hara.
Sort of O'Hara and Rivers and Ashbury and Grace Hartigan, kind of like the sort of 4 years.
We should talk of Grace. Yeah, I mean that
talk
sounds great.
yeah.
I'd love to hear more about
Yeah,
that. That sounds
please.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And like kind of like a little bit like when they were at Harvard and they were doing
Sort of
these.
kind of starts Frank's like. Sorry, I'm sort of taking.
So maybe you don't want to do it.
So starts. Frank moves to New York. Like comes to this party that Ashbury throws. Comes to this party that Ashbury throws, and Frank and Larry like kiss behind this curtain,
and everyone can see their sneakers. Yeah.
And then basically like thus begins Frank's like sort of bizarre obsession with him, where he kind of uses Jane to get close to Larry, and like is constantly hanging out with Jane. He's like, let's hang out, and then it's like he looks to Larry, and kind of breaks them up, and then kind of pushes Jane away and says, you shouldn't see him.
Yeah.
And then he's like, oh, now it's just us now, and he can be with Larry. And then I think Larry like slashes his wrists in sort of torment about Jane, and then Frank's like, but before he does so, he checks the phone's plugged in, calls Frank. So the play is it's sort of just this sort of weird psychodrama about how much.
Sounds fantastic. sounds like you're not sure of drama, at least.
There's lots of drama.
It sounds great, wonderful.
I think we all want an invite to the premiere.
Questions, or we can move next door.
Wow, that is actual perfect timing. Thank you everyone for fantastic questions, and thank you most of all to Matthew for a really wonderful book, and for talking to us about it this evening. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.